more people are before the courts now in relation to that violence in Coolock on Monday night. So 13 people initially were brought before the special sitting of the criminal courts that evening, and then further charges have been brought. So 19, 20 people arrested?
Yeah, I think it's 19 people ultimately coming before the courts, mostly for, relatively minor charges. But you may well see more people come before the courts in the next few days, as well as, the guards go through CCTV and all of that type of evidence.
There are people before the courts now, and that will have to take its course. The usual presumption of innocence applies. So we're not going to discuss those cases here in the podcast, but we are going to talk generally about scenes that were witnessed and some of the background. It was much videoed, wasn't it? And recorded like all these incidents are.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. It was, there's a lot of, if you look back at the Dublin riots, obviously people are still being picked up in the last few weeks, even in connection with CCTV footage that had gone on. So yeah, people were recording it from start to finish.
But I think the Dublin riots, in fairness, it was a winter's night. It was December, wasn't it? And it was dark. So this was the exact opposite. If you look at any of the footage you see on social media are coming from some of the more mainstream media places as well, including our own. Like, they're really recognisable, the people involved in it. Some of them have hoods up and all the rest of it. And initially looking at it, it looks like these are sort of largely young males. They look as if they've nothing to do. It's summertime, they're off, and they're joining in a riot. And it looks like a lot of them don't even know what the hell they're rioting for.
Well, maybe so, but a lot of the younger people have been the most videoed, though. You can see them on with their hoods up and maybe on electric bikes and stuff like that. But there's a lot of people up for public order for resisting arrest. So, look, it was.
I think the addresses tell a story, in a way, because this is all centred on a site that has been earmarked for asylum seekers in Coolock. It's a former Crown paint factory, and work was due to begin in it. It's a long way off, actually, housing anybody.
Yeah.
But some of the addresses are local.
Yeah.
And some of them are from pretty, distances. So, you can see from the addresses who has come into the area and who's already possibly there. You don't know, of course, where everybody is during the day. But the fact of the matter is, it starts up in the morning.
Yeah.
And there is an attack on a digger or a JCB or something like this. Okay?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there'd been a camp outside Crown Paints. A lot of people will have seen it if they drive past. It's been there for a number of months. Is it 3 or 4 months?
Yeah.
Coolock Says No, or I think are the name of the organisation there. People have been camping out 24 hours a day. Obviously, the government or, the law decided to move them on, and that was done overnight. And then construction workers were brought in on the site early in the morning. As soon as that occurred, there was a number of attacks. There was a congregation of people. There was barriers that had been put up for kind of light barriers, basically, steel barriers, but not particularly permanent or strong. Some of them were overthrown. Then there was a fire was set underneath a JCB digger, I think, that was due to begin work there, and it quickly kind of escalated out of control. A couple of hundred people congregated on the site. There were some Gardaí there, but they seem to have been not enough, I think it's fair to say, at that point to quell that disturbance. That went on till sometime around midday. That seemed to calm down. And then within a couple of hours later, things kind of kicked off again at a number of locations close to the Crown Paint site, but not just at that Crown Paint site. Some up by Coolock Garda Station, which is, a few hundred metres up the road, effectively. And you could see it all happened in real time. Anybody who has, Twitter or X can see it as it's happening. Reporters are there. Far right, I suppose, sites are there sharing it. Some elected representatives are sharing it, and it all goes on for everyone to see. It happens in real time. And, it's a very, very strong reaction from the government today. obviously we've seen a range of protests, places like Newtown Mount Kennedy, places in Tipperary, where the government and the local representatives have, I suppose, could you say they've been slightly careful about what they say? Would that be fair to say? With some of these protests where they've spoken about, the decent people in the community and all of that. But this kind of outbreak of violence has sparked the opposite reaction from...
they've been condemning the violence, but they have... We were talking about this earlier. There seems to be this kind of collective narrative that these people just don't understand what's going on, and we'll just explain it to them, and then then people will have an understanding that they've been sort of feeding off a false narrative that's been put out, and that's why this has happened.
Yeah, I mean,
which is a little bit...
Well, I mean...
A little bit dismissive, I think, a little bit condescending and stuff. I mean, a little bit. Now, obviously, they're talking about this social media, call to riot, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't know. I mean, this is where this country is. There's 550 asylum seekers due to be housed there. And let's be realistic, it's been met with determined opposition, not just from, as we've heard over the years, these far-right agitators, a handful of them trying to...
But I mean, how big has the protest been out there?
Well, it's been quite big, and it's been quite big, obviously.
But what sort of numbers are you talking outside it? About 200?
Well, I mean, it's not been like that every day, of course.
No.
It's been far less at times. But there are, it is an opposition from within the community. Certainly when these protests started to spring
within
up,
and outside.
Within and
because you're
outside.
seeing the addresses of a lot of those that are, accused of engaging in threatening, abusive or insulting behaviour, that are, charged with failing to comply with the guarded directions. And they're not from the area for a start. Now, I mean, look, it is widely, it's Dublin. Coolock is in Dublin. So,
yeah.
a lot of these people would say they're protesting against, Dublin being the focus of a place to house asylum seekers. But Coolock is a massive area.
Yeah.
Let's not forget that. It's an absolute... That's why I was asking you the kind of levels of people that are actually standing there day in, day out, protesting to it, because Coolock certainly, and by even the sort of 1980s, had a population of 20,000.
Yeah.
No, it's huge. It's a very big, vast, sprawling area that would take in Kilbarrack and Darndale, etc. Moatview, Eatonmore, all these places are sort of seen under the banner of Coolock.
Yeah.
It's an area that has the largest stock of state brick and mortar.
Yeah.
It certainly has had in the past. Obviously, some of that property has been sold into private ownership, but it's a vast, vast area.
Yeah.
And is this a representative of that area, or is this just tiny little...
Well, I mean, it's very...
number.
Well, it's something in the middle, Nicola. A lot of these things, there is genuine opposition from within the community. And there's also a vast majority of people living in that area who aren't protesting and no doubt have been disgusted by the scenes because
but could also be concerned and are afraid to get mixed up in that. Do you know what I mean? Maybe they're concerned on a more sensible level.
Yeah, but there's two narratives. So the first narrative is from the protesters who they clearly and openly say, we represent the vast majority of people. We're the silent majority. You see the signs. This is what people really think. And this is all from within the community. And people don't want these asylum seekers coming in. So that's one narrative. And that's not true. Then the other narrative is from other people that it's just a handful of far-right agitators, probably funded by some US dark money organization, and they have zero support in the community. And that's not fully true either. There is some support in the community. There is, I suppose you could say, ordinary people, mothers and kids and everything at these protests. This is where we are at this country. We are not at a point for simple answers. Now, you see Simon Harris, Helen McEntee and Drew Harris, and they've come out and described it as absolute thuggery. And can there be any doubt? I mean, I saw one video there of, is it a bus trying to get down the road and there's guys going up and kicking the bus and smashing the bus. And like, you think, what in God's name has that got to do with politics?
What have the buses got to do with anything?
Exactly.
Like, they're carrying the public into the area.
Exactly. So, I mean, can that be described as anything but, as the Simon Harris said, total thuggery? Of course it can't. I mean, it's just
dancing on police cars and throwing rocks at the faces of Garda Síochána working as well is pretty thuggery to me too.
Exactly.
So that's
So
all.
no, it's all thuggery. I think I can't remember if it's Simon Harris or somebody says, throwing a petrol bomb at a guard is not an act of political protest. These people aren't protesters. So, like, all of that is true. I mean, it's not. I'm not saying that's not true, but the idea that that there's no support in the community, or this is absolutely just a handful of people. It's something more complicated than that. I mean, like, we've had these debates about immigration. I mean, when did we do our first one? You do it, say, a couple of years ago, probably Dublin riots or whatever, and you put it up and there's a stream of abuses coming at you. And we know from reporting on crime, I mean, we do crime stories. Well, I do them 3 days a week or 2 days a week, and you do them 5. It's
generous of you.
Right. So if you look at the Ashling Murphy trial or something, so you have immigration. A man kills a woman at the end of the day. So immigration becomes a huge issue. In that, people use these crimes the way they want to use them, don't they? Like, they use it as an anti-immigration thing. Or, for example, there's recent cases where people will use them as, to do with, say, support on issues to do with domestic violence or whatever. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. But, immigration is a huge issue in this country. And the level of violence in our politics is increasing. We're not alone in that. I mean, this is a Western world phenomenon. That the level of violence. But
underlying it all is whether those people are coming in from the far right or they are concerned locals who don't have far right leanings. The underlying sort of collective is that the state can't provide people from here with housing, and these people are coming in and they're being provided with housing.
Yeah.
And that the other thing that I've seen a lot of there is that Coolock has been long forgotten. It's been marginalised, etc. And now this problem is coming in on top of it. And that bit of it is the truth. So Coolock started to be built in around the 60s and the 70s, and it was a little village.
Yeah.
And it was part of the state's response to the tenement housing. And other areas, of course, had been built up before then. Crumlin would be older. Cabra would be older.
Yeah, parts of Finglas as well.
So by the 1980s, right, that phased inner city slum clearance had created this vast sort of council estate of Coolock, Darndale, Donamead, all those places I've mentioned. And already by then, only 20 years in existence, the image and reputation of Coolock, along with Ballymun, was kind of rubber stamped and sort of in the nation's psyche as a crime black spot. And, there was a load of reasons for that. Planning, promises of jobs, promises of green space and local facilities that didn't follow on from the building work. But at the heart of the problem from the beginning lay unemployment, because of course the 1980s was the big recession. We had 100,000 people out of work. And then 200,000 people out of work within 4 years, like double it. And Coolock and areas like that, while the national unemployment rate at that point, I mean, it's hard to believe, isn't it? 27% was the national unemployment rate. How grim is that? But that was the national average. But Coolock and other areas, and it was discovered and found by local employment agencies that the rate of unemployment in those areas was even higher, sometimes up to 65%. 65% unemployment. And of course, the 80s also had the first heroin epidemic. Coolock and Artane were hit with the Stardust disaster, which is something that has resonated within the population for decades. 1986 was the Self-Aid concert. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
14-hour concert at the RDS to highlight the unemployment problem in Ireland. Things were dark across Ireland, but they were particularly dark sort of in that, in the area we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see the failures in urban planning, certainly in Ballymun, for example. I mean, that's probably the most infamous example of how bad urban planning, a bad idea can have such long-term implications. And obviously, Ballymun Towers went up. It was an area that wasn't serviced properly. When the drug epidemic hit, it hit particularly hard. And, parts of Dublin sprang up without any thought. So then, you have the consequences, which are, of course, you're still feeling it to this day in parts of Coolock.
There was also, of course, then, if you thought the 80s were bad, the 90s weren't much better for areas like that because a second heroin epidemic came in the early 90s. And also there was things that the state did, which didn't help. Not just, things like drugs coming in. But there was a report done a couple of years ago by the former Assistant Commissioner, Dr. Jack Nolan, right? And it was about Darndale, actually, and the long-term view of the enduring social economic challenges in the area. And he pointed to that by 1991, graffiti at the entrance to Darndale said, welcome to Darndale, twinned with Beirut, which of course was, a city in Lebanon that was pockmarked by bullet and in a war. Yeah. Exactly. And that was he was pointing to, that was it was okay. It was a sense of humour, but it was indicative of some elements of the local population's opinion and image and self-worth of that area. And he pointed to this thing called the Surrender Grant Scheme, which was introduced by Dublin City Council in the 90s. And that was when people were offered a grant of 10,000 to give up their local authority housing and to buy in the private sector to make way for other tenants. So we're obviously seeing pressures begin on the social housing at this stage. But the problem with that scheme, and it did begin in the very late 1980s, was that some areas were harder hit by it, because what you had it was people who were working and who were probably, contributing to the community and would have been more community leaders. They were the ones who went for the Surrender Grant Scheme because they had a job, they had other income, they would profit from the 10,000 state grant, and they moved their families out of these areas. That freed up accommodation, and into that came sort of, other marginalised areas of the population, like single mothers and homeless men. Mm. So you're going into the 1990s and you're still struggling, really. Yeah. And of course, then the 1990s, as we well know, you have this growth of recreational drugs, ecstasy first and later cocaine. And you have all these job opportunities opening up for young, marginalised men largely in this new industry, which is the recreation. So it's been a bit of one decade after the next has been catastrophic somewhat. Obviously, there's plenty of people living in the areas not touched by this kind of stuff, but there's plenty of people who are. So to come along to this sort of decade and to be looking to the housing of asylum seekers seems to, as being the problem on the area, seems to me to be ignoring the past.
And look, of course, you're right, 100%. I mean, I agree, they're complex problems that have deep roots going back a long time. And exactly what you said, I mean, in terms of the drugs trade, which is sort of what we speak about more than the political aspect. But yes, there was opportunities for young men to be involved in drugs and make a lot of money. And those opportunities weren't replicated in the normal economy. So you had in the 2000s and the 2000s in particular, if you came from a very educated background and you had money in your family, you could start off in this property ladder and we know people who are making money in their mid-20s were making a fortune.
Those who are broke.
Yeah, some of them are broke now, but they had, because of that opportunity, of their background. They had an opportunity to go on and do these things. Now, if you're coming from certain other disadvantaged backgrounds, you don't have that opportunity, but you still live in a society where you see people making a lot of money. And therefore, the attraction of the drugs trade is greater, because that is the opportunity that's there for you. And the other opportunities are only there for people who have that background, who have that money in their thing, who have those connections. So there's no doubt about that.
All of this, by the way, is coupled obviously with the constant growing population of Dublin, the expanse of that population, and the fact that there just simply isn't housing. That hasn't caught up. That's at the heart of it there as well, with all those other issues.
Yeah, that is the core of it. Like, we have an accommodation crisis in this city, in this country, but in this city in particular. And what happens are that people have been raised in communities sometimes under pressure, as you describe, but still the community from where people come from. When they hit their 20s, when they have kids, is there an opportunity for them to buy a home or to own a home in that community, whether they buy it or not? And traditionally, even though communities are under pressure, there was an opportunity for people who grew up in an area when they had their own children, whether they're in a permanent relationship or not, to live within that community surrounded by their family and friends of where they've grown up. That is no longer necessarily the case. And that drives a lot of this resentment, this anger, and some of that anger is, focused, ends up being focused on asylum seekers. I mean, that is the reality. And then it gets focused it becomes with the belief that people are not being listened to and are being spoken down to. And you can see that in all the tenor of all the social media. I've looked at it all day, and the people who are protesting are saying, it's all about class and you're not listening to working class people and all of this. And, so
the accommodation issue is, replicating itself somewhat rather, in certain European countries, and even, on some of the islands that are, driven by tourism, economies driven by tourism. A lot of the properties have been bought up by tourists who use them as holiday homes, and locals can't get accommodation or afford it. And there's protests all over Europe.
There's protests all over Europe.
Anti-tourism protests. They're in Barcelona, they're in Lanzarote. They're in all these places that are traditionally, the economy has been completely buoyed up by tourism, and yet everyone's turned. And in Rome as well, I believe that there is this sort of sentiment that, and of course these places are so crowded. And
but is it so crowded, or like there is another broader issue about how money gets circulated around the economy? And look, the macroeconomics on crime world, but what you had during the banking crisis, you had the debts all over Europe and all over the world were put on ordinary people effectively, and the people with money had their assets protected, and they bought properties as investment properties, and that's just what has happened. So that's the context of the anger. But I mean, how you can go from that to saying it's okay to smash the window of a bus or throw a petrol bomb at a guard, it just doesn't compute. I mean, in a way, like if you were to look at what people are saying and, about communities being left behind, I mean, the sort of scenes you see yesterday, it actually allows the political establishment to ignore any legitimate concerns that communities might have. And you can see that before your eyes today, that every legitimate concern is just wiped out now. And I
just think it was very lazy and very dismissive of all three to come with the narrative. They just don't understand. Yeah. Because I think it's like, it's not sort of taking on board all those other issues that we would have discussed that are there in the background that are forming part of this, ball of fury that's happened. But just to come out and say they've just been misinformed and we'll tell them exactly what's happening and we'll just tell them exactly what's happening with these asylum seekers, and then they'll understand and they'll all go away and won't protest anymore. I think there's an ignorance to that too.
There is an ignorance, and then there's the other side of it, which is that, are you going to stop bringing, can the state really, because some people kick off and smash up cars and stuff, that you're going to then roll over and not, allow that to win. You can't as a state. So, I mean, look,
there's only one answer to it, and it is policing it. I mean, that's what they're going to do. They're going to protect those communities, and they're going to arrest and use the full force of the law against anybody who does any of these.
I mean, there is some part of it that it seemed that they were under-resourced initially in the guards, and obviously the GRA have come out today and said that wasn't managed properly. I mean, that's their perspective.
Drew Harris didn't agree with that.
No, he didn't agree with that, and neither did Helen McEntee, but that's what the GRA, the Garda Representative Association, have said. But like, all you're seeing is these are hugely complex problems. And like, if you look, obviously we had Donald Trump being shot at. Like, that is the outworking of a decade maybe of increasingly fractious, violent political discourse in America growing year by year, and it culminates in an attempted assassination one way or the other. And, you know, these things are kind of happening here. And yeah, I agree with you.
We don't have access to guns the way they do in the States. I mean, a 20-year-old guy can get training as a huntsman, you know, and buy a weapon like that probably legally, and we don't have that issue. So there is all other complex issues going on in the States,
but you have that separation within society where you have people effectively in a war or a culture war, or a dismissive of each other, and in a unable to come in the middle. Actually, I don't know if you heard Donald Trump's interview afterward, and after the shooting, his first interview, and he says, and like, I'm not a Donald Trump man, as you know, but he said, it's very hard I'd love to bring people together, but it's very hard to come together when you have one people who want open borders and the other people who don't want nothing to do with open borders. Where's the middle ground? And, you know, that is a problem in society if there is no middle ground. That said, you know, like, if you looked at the protesters, and I heard some of them there, and they're talking about just 550 people due to come in, men, women and children is what the Department of Integration have said clearly and specifically. And the idea, you know, if you read social media, and, you know, that these are like, you would think that they're bringing in 550 convicted sex offenders by some of the comments. It's not. These are ordinary people who've come from difficult circumstances. And they're, you know, we're part of international treaties, and we allow international protection applicants in. And the idea that these people are demons or, you know, rapists and murderers, you know, it's just not true. I mean, there's a percentage of people that of non-immigrant background that commit crime, but there's plenty of homegrown criminals as well. I mean, I think it's very sad. It's not a pleasant scene. We've had 2 full-on riots in the country in the last year, and in the 10 years before, I don't think, you know, when do we have anything like that? So it's going to happen again.
Well, I'll just leave that final note to you, so as you can get hammered in the comments, and they'll all just think I was very much.
What were you?
Fen City, was I?
I don't know.
I don't know what it was. Anyway, look, we do have to report on these things, and obviously that's a major story that has occurred, and we're not going to be silenced just because, you know, you get trolled.
No.
I don't care. Look, it just happens and it goes away again.
No,
day,
I mean, it does. And look, you know, people, that is the problem. I mean, Donald Trump, again, like, he's diagnosed it. Like, where is the middle ground? And I mean, that's what
you could say that about anything.
Well, you could, but you know,
you have to find the middle ground.
Yes, you have to exactly.
You know, you have to communicate and try and find a middle ground. But to say there is no middle ground, like, you could say that about absolutely anything, that life is black and white. It isn't.
Well, I mean, I think if you look at the North, you had no middle ground between Republicans and loyalists, and they actually were able to find it, but it required people at least attempting to meet in the middle. The idea that throwing a petrol bomb at a police station is going to address the fundamental social issues.
And look, there are still people up in the North doing that, but they don't represent the majority of the population. No. The majority of the population wants to find that middle ground. They did, and they're living largely successfully with it. You'll still see rioters up there all the time, actually, particularly in Derry, and you'll see the PSNI going in with force and the same, never learning from the past and still doing exactly what they've done wrong time and time again. But there you go.
Yeah, I mean, look, people will say about the guards, there's two narratives. There's one, the guards are not hard enough. I mean, that's obviously the GRA have said to an extent they're not organised, but there's plenty of people ringing in saying they should have gone in and shot people effectively. And then you have the protesters, and, you know, Simon Harris says they shouldn't be called protesters, but they're putting up social media pictures saying of people being pepper sprayed, and there's elected councillors were pepper sprayed, and saying that, you know, that the guards overreacted. And but, you know, you can't, like, any society that allows open violence like that is not a successful society, so it should not be allowed.
No, and you heard, I presume, the big shout out of the whole thing was that the guards are now wearing cams on them. Like, I mean, too late.
Yeah.
Guys, we should have been doing that 10 years ago. I mean, we must be last at the table with the cameras, and to be out there celebrating it and saying it's going to be part of the court cases in the future and all the rest of it. Of course it will, but they should have been using them for a long time.
Yeah.
All right. We'll leave it at that.
Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.